Bible prophecy is literally jumping off the pages of the Bible. And I realize that many times we do not have access to a media because it's controlled and it doesn't give us the true meaning of world news. We're only reported through the mass media, ABC, CBS, NBC, the large metropolitan newspapers, what they want us to see. So we don't always comprehend what is about to happen and how close we are to the very end of the age. But in Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 to 5, it gives us just a little indication. It says, the burden of the word of the Lord for Israel. Notice, Israel is all 12 tribes, and one of them is Joseph, and there are two twin tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. So if you wanted to get real technical about it, you could call it 13 tribes. Since two of them are half tribes, they just call them 12 tribes of Israel. And this is the burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, says the Lord, which stretched forth the heavens. So it's the Lord that's done all this. And he lays the foundation of the earth, and he forms the spirit of man within him. So God's spirit within man gives us the reasoning power, intellect. It works with the physical senses, the eye, the smell, the taste, touch, and so on. Therefore, we can accumulate information and store it into our computer-like brain. Verse 2, behold, I'll make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem. Notice verse 1, it talked about Israel, and suddenly in verse 2, it narrows down one of those 12 tribes of Israel to Judah, who was a tribe of Judah and Benjamin combined. And they were left in the land after the northern 10 tribes of Israel went into national captivity. And I mention this because of the last scripture I'm going to give in today's sermon. Notice now there is going to be a siege both against Judah and Jerusalem. And what do we see on the world scene today? We see Jerusalem literally surrounded by the Arab, by the Islam religion, who are being supplied all type of sophisticated weaponry by the Soviet bloc. And in that day, verse 3, will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. Verse 4, in that day, says the Lord, will I smite every horse with astonishment, and his rider with madness. And I'll open mine eyes upon the house of Judah, and will smite every horse of the people with blindness. And the governors of Judah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem shall be my strength, and the Lord of hosts their God. Now, this is a prophecy for the very end of the age. Judah is besieged right now. Jerusalem is being besieged by all the Arab nations around about who are being equipped militarily by the Soviet Union. Not only that, let's look in the New Testament and see what Jesus said in Luke chapter 21 about the very end of the age. Luke 21, verse 20 to 24. Jesus had already been asked by his disciples what would be the sign of his coming of the end of the age. And he told a whole scenario of events that were going to occur. They would accumulate and mushroom to the very end of the time. Verse 20. And when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, wasn't that what we just saw in Zechariah 12? It would be in besiege. Then know that the desolation thereof is nigh, or near. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. This is talking about Christians. Don't remain in an area that you see is going to become volatile, and it's going to be dangerous for your health. And let not them that are in the countries enter therein. So don't anybody from any other country on earth, if we're a Christian, go there deliberately when we see these volatile events about to explode in our face. Verse 22, for these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles shall be fulfilled. And when you read in Revelation, you'll see that the times of the Gentiles will literally be the last 3.5 year period of this age before Jesus Christ returns. But now, I want to give you a fictionalized scenario of what could happen. I mean, at any moment. And it could happen next year, 4 years from now. We don't know the exact chronology in which Jesus has set down his timetable. Now, I have a few hints here and there, but I wouldn't preach them as doctrine because too many people have set dates and then they've been embarrassed by it, and there are people who follow them have lost. They've been depending on a date and a man rather than God, and knowing that only God knows for sure what's about to happen. So I'm going to give you a little fictionalized story for a moment to lead in to the rest of the sermon. It was 2 p.m. in New York, 11 a.m. in Los Angeles, and it was 8 a.m. in Hawaii when all hell broke loose in Jerusalem. Small missiles were dropping in carefully placed destinations every 4 minutes. So here is a carefully planned dropping of strategic small missiles in the Jerusalem area every 4 minutes. Pandemonium broke loose in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, and also in the West Jerusalem. Mayor Teddy Kollek picked up the red phone and dialed a pre-arranged number that rang in 17 offices of the members of the Knesset, including the Prime Minister of Israel and his cabinet and various party members. We're being pulverized by enemy missiles. This is the red alert. Mobilize and help us immediately. Now, to get a call on that line meant only one thing to those who were answering the phone. This was an emergency of national proportions, and that it could only mean an act by the dreaded PLO or a direct invasion by the Soviet Union. But in this particular case, I'll call it the PLO for just our benefit. Now, more than one minister in the cabinet and the Knesset had predicted, along with the Prime Minister for many years, that war was about to break out, and it could break out on a monumental scale at any time. Military alert had been sounded for months within Jerusalem and all the countryside. And every single able-bodied man and woman had been conscripted, trained, and equipped for the military. And they literally wore their weapons and their uniforms to work as a civilian every single day. And they had been in a crash course to train them how to use these various weapons. And each person carried hand grenades and automatic weapons. Each Israeli living in Israel, surrounded by the military might of the Arabs supplied by the Soviet Union, knew that they were about to be in a life and death situation. They knew the upcoming battle was either for their survival or extinction, one or the other. No in between, because all the minor battles had already been fought. Every single treaty had already been broken that had been made, and now they were ready for the all-out confrontation. And David Ben-Gurion had already stated that they would fight to the very last man, woman, and child. And they would not give up one single inch of their territory in the Middle East. The military attack came through Lebanon, Syria, and also through Jordan, with troops coming in through Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And then there were also Muslim troops and military equipment that had been shipped in from certain other countries by Gaddafi of Libya, by Pakistan and Kuwait, because all these are Islam nations, and the United Arab mini-states along the Persian Gulf. So they had supplied equipment and funds for the purchase of this equipment from the Soviet Union. Reports were now coming in from the North and South Yemen that they were going to send huge contingencies of men along with Somalia and Ethiopia. So truly, there was about to be the greatest Holocaust on the face of the earth. But the big news was that the Soviet Union had supplied the weaponry, and it was in the hand of every single combat officer and regular in the armies of the Arabs, with large battalions of Soviet armed troops waiting on the borders just in case the Arabs failed in their pursuit of Israel, and to drive them out of the West Bank and Jerusalem and into the Mediterranean Sea. If the PLO plot failed in their attempt, the Soviets were now committed to more than just supervision of the coordination of the Arab battalions. They were now committed to fight to the finish, regardless of the American and European position and intervention. Now, prior to this, I would say, dreadful hour, negotiations had been going on for months, days, until all the parties who were going to be involved in this war were worn out and could receive no settlement over the West Bank and Jerusalem. Israel was adamant and would not budge an inch. She had gone so far as to take the land, and she had given all the concessions that she was going to, and would not any longer give up another inch of territory. Former Egyptian leader Sadat, before he died, and Menachem Begin, had accomplished the opening up of borders between Egypt and Israel. And so they thought they had a peace treaty. And this treaty turned off the rest of the Arab nations. So we can see that there is now a scenario set up where all the Arab countries supplied by the Soviet Union are now ready for the attack on little tiny Israel, and they started dropping the bombs every 4 minutes. The United States had struggled within these negotiations to virtually force Israel to give in to the Arab demands, because we're the one that supplies most of their technical equipment, most of their military equipment, and their hard cash because of their faltering economy in the Middle East. And yet they wouldn't cut back. So now the Arabs had started to cut back oil shipments to the United States. The United States was now beginning to hurt badly. They were suffering their own economic Armageddon because of the oil cutbacks from the Middle East, because we couldn't do anything in handling Israel. But Canada began to help the United States through direct negotiations with their new Prime Minister. But it didn't do any good. So finally they began to supply some of their much needed oil to their southern neighbors. Mexico also began to supply oil to the United States to keep us afloat so that we could in turn help Israel in the Middle East. But it wasn't significant enough in order to keep our factories going. So all of a sudden, the United States of America came into its greatest depression in the history of the world. No president could stop it because it was all based upon oil. With an energized society based upon oil and the cutoff of that oil, no factories could hum. Homes couldn't cool themselves. They couldn't heat themselves in winter. Automobiles couldn't travel the highways. Congress couldn't meet. They could, but they couldn't get anything done because the Arabs had the American economy tied up in their hands. Now, even the Arabs were receiving and developing nuclear power, that it was being supplied to them through the Soviet Union. But the United States, with all of our super sophisticated nuclear power weapons, were having difficulty in launching them and getting them to Israel in the Middle East because of the lack of oil. But you see, we had come so far, hindsight does us no good anymore, because now we're in the greatest crisis at the very end of the age, when all hell is about to break loose in the Middle East. The emergency was on. Countless businesses were beginning to shut down all over the country. Hundreds of others were going out of business. And yet others declared bankruptcy. And of course your huge corporation hid behind the bankruptcy laws and just rescheduled their payments. But economic pandemonium was now breaking loose all over the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, and literally the only nation that could stop the attack of the Arabs and the Soviet Union in the Middle East. American politicians had tried to force Israel into giving up the West Bank and a part of Jerusalem and the rest of Lebanon before it was too late. But now, Saudi Arabia, one of the greatest allies the United States had ever had now turned upon us. And Saudi Arabia was now cutting back its oil. We were given a 30 to 60 day notice that either we shut down Israel, all aid to them, or all oil, even from our staunchest ally in the Arab camp, would now be cut off. All oil. Nothing worked anymore. The United States was now in great economic confusion, and we were about to collapse as a whole society. Now crime was beginning to go on the rampage as people begged for food. They borrowed. They stole just to eat and to live, because the mothers were saying, just a little milk to let my child have something to drink. I don't want my baby to starve. Suddenly the automobile industry, which is the greatest and most dynamic occupation in this country, was shut down. The steel mills ground to a halt. The entertainment centers folded. Lake Tahoe and Reno, for the first time since they started, rolled up the carpet and they actually went to bed for the first time in the history of those cities. However, Los Angeles was a little larger, and they were holding on by a thin thread until the last millionaires lost their income. Nobody was thinking about pleasure anymore. Everyone in the United States of America just began to think about sheer survival and existence. Suicides began to become the greatest of all time. that outstripped the 1929 crash. People in all walks of life were beginning to feel the terrible squeeze because, you see, the dollar, which is no longer backed by gold or silver, began to topple. Inflation went rampant. The millions of dollars which people had in savings were now gone and exhausted. There was no food to be bought because there was no fertilizer, which comes from the chemical industry. The government of the United States was now mobilizing for war. Every ounce of energy was going to be forced in the direction of war and taken away from all homes and industry. Hawaii was now on full alert for Soviet submarines in that region. And the NORAD, which is our radar system, was constantly watching for a full-scale Soviet attack on the United States. All United States military watchdogs were now on full alert. And that did it. Millions were beginning to parade in the streets. They were demanding that the government go to war, declare war upon the Arabs immediately. Just a few years earlier, the Americans had extracted themselves from the most volatile war that they had ever been in that just ripped this nation apart, the Vietnam conflict. They said, never again will we fight on foreign soil. And yet this was different. This was for the very survival of their own families. They either invaded the Soviet Union or the Arab nations to gain oil, or the United States as a country would demise. Millions were now demonstrating to go to war with the Arabs. The country was split, and there was optimism on one side because they wanted war, and yet there was pessimism and death and starvation and malnutrition on the other side. After weeks of dragging this on, the decision whether to go to war or not, finally they decided, we will fight to get our oil. So the President of the United States responded, and the Congress of the United States finally adopted a warlike policy. Now, does what I just said sound very far-fetched? Very way out? I don't think so. Because there was a man, and I have quoted him before, and I will quote him in part 2 of this message, a General George Keegan, Jr. He's a retired Air Force Major General who resigned for one specific purpose, because he had all of the information at his disposal that the Soviet Union was preparing for the military launch of all the Arab nations with their own battalions to back up the invasion of Israel. And at the same time, because the United States would be so weakened from the lack of oil, that we would be attacked at the same time. And he had this information at his disposal, and yet no one would listen to him. It was being deliberately suppressed by those members of the Council on Foreign Relations in the political arena in the United States. And so he had to retire from the military so that he could now travel the country and speak and write books, go on talk shows, wherever they'll allow him to be, to give the true facts as what's about to happen. And now I want to quote him. After 60 years of aggression by the Soviets, only 17% of the remaining world population lives in what could be termed a free society. And the rate of decline of that free society is about 6 percentage points a year. So you think about that for a minute. If there's only 17% of the remaining world that is considered free, and about 6% is losing per year, how many more years will it be until the Soviet Union finally has gobbled up the entirety of the earth? If this continues at the rate it is now, it would only give us 3 years left. But I'm not setting dates. I'm only quoting what this man said. Now, the general, who was a former assistant to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force Intelligence, concludes that the Soviets are going through the most extensive war preparations in history. And the Soviet Union themselves, their own leaders, in this case Khrushchev, said they would continue to build, and then they would go into talks like the SALT I, SALT II treaty, and cause the United States to stop building their military preparedness until they would so be prepared by the mid-1980s. And where are we today? 1985 is the mid-1980s. That by the time they reach the mid-1980s, they would be in such a position of strength that the United States would either acquiesce, just give in, or else we would suffer great damage at the hands of the Soviet military apparatus. Now, many other Americans, Canadians, French, and English people are saying the same thing that General George Keegan, because the British intelligence is one of the best in the world. And they have known for some years, at least 7 or 8 years, that the Soviet Union has now surpassed in military strength the United States. But of course, the news media won't ever say anything like that. Never. But of course, we know who controls the news media too. Just look at any Council on Foreign Relations or Trilateral Commission list of membership, then look at who carries the news and who runs AP, UPI, and Reuters Press. And you'll see who censors the news and will only allow that which they want to come out to the American people. Now, the following amount of facts that I'm going to give you is very disturbing, because you see, Bible prophecy has to happen. And yet here you and I, God's people, with God's Holy Spirit, looking forward to the end of the age, and yet you and I must muster up the strength in Christ Jesus to go through all of these problems that are going to engulf the whole world at the end of the age. Now, there are 2 oil cartels in the world today. Most think that there's only one, and that's OPEC in the Middle East, made up of Arab conglomerates. But it's not. There are twin powers in the world. The OPEC cartel is one, and the other is right here in the United States of America. And I'll get into that in just a minute. And it is totally controlled, and it's married to 8 international banking companies, the 8 largest banks in the United States. There are 7 what's called sister companies in the oil industry. Their board of directors are interlocked with the 8 international banking companies, which are the largest in the United States. So international bankers, which supplied the funds to build international communism and socialism and build it up economically, are the very same ones who control the energy in the United States of America. And when you begin to understand this, then you can see how these people can literally create the greatest catastrophe in the United States by taking the very energy from us so that we cannot defend ourselves against the Soviet buildup. Now, after I get through listing some of these facts, you'll begin to see, put the puzzle together and see who it is that controls the energy and the foreign policy of the United States of America. This is all from George Keegan's facts. And he had to retire from the Air Force in order to be able to get this out to the public. Now, number 1, there are 2 oil cartels, not just one. That's a misconception. The domestic or internal United States cartel is interlocked with the 8 biggest banks in an interlocking directorship. So I may be the director of Mobil Oil Company, then I may also be the director of Chemical Bank in New York, see? Therefore, I make policy for both corporations. And so what's good for one corporation, I'm going to see to it that it's good for the other. Or whatever purposes as a giant company that I want to create, that's the goal that I'm going to go for in the policy of my 2 companies. We have really not even begun to develop our own energy sources. And an example of that is in Alaska. And I've mentioned this before. The book put out the Energy Non-Crisis by Lindsey Williams, where he was right there on the spot. He had access to all documentation, and he has documented that the Gull Island fine was the largest in the United States, period. And that our own government ordered it shutting down, and not even to report that the fine was there. And there was enough oil in that one pool in Alaska, more than all of Saudi Arabia, which is the greatest oil-rich company in the world. And yet we have it right here in our own United States, but it can't be developed by order of the government of the United States. Now, something else we need to remember, that it was predicted by Lenin back in 1917, 18, and 19, and also by a man by the name of Ezekiel 2,500 years ago, that little tiny Israel in the Middle East and the United States of America would fight Russia, and it would be in the latter days. And I believe it. And the whole world is set up strategically right now for that final conflict between international socialism, communism, which calls itself atheism, but it's not. It's those who control it worship Lucifer by name, and therefore the rise of this power. Now also, as a result of the oil cartel and the international bank marriage in this country, We are about to have the greatest economic Armageddon first in order to cause the collapse of this country before the military apparatus of the Soviet Union would dare to invade. They've got to invade us from a position of weakness in order to win in their own mind. There will be a massive war between the superpowers. They'll use both conventional and nuclear weapons to the ultimate. To the ultimate. I'm thoroughly convinced, now this is me personally, based upon all the prophecies that I've studied and preached about now for the last 5 years, that the United States of America is going to win this war with the Arabs and the Soviets. But the United States is going to come out bleeding so badly, for the first time they're going to call out to their God in unison for repentance. And it'll literally take Jesus Christ to step in to stop world suicide and bring about the great God of Israel and the kingdom of God on this earth. Now, once you're armed with all the facts that are coming in from all over the world and who is behind all of this massive buildup militarily, then you're better able to understand all the maze of reasons why this war is unavoidable. It's just totally unavoidable. Because when you start economically crippling the United States and those who control the oil, and then they deliberately will not go out and mine and research and develop more oil, when it's enough right here that we would not have to depend upon any country at all. Just one pool in Alaska, the Gull Island, would be enough to supply all the natural gas and petroleum for the next 200 years at the rate of increase of our population. And that's a statistical fact. And the government's got it, and Arco Corporation, but they can't announce it. And so you see, when we have the oil, but those who are controlling and wanting to take over as world power, they have the economic and the political clout in order to cut off the oil and not even let it be pumped from the ground. So they can literally set up wars, rumors of wars, and then when you have rumors of wars and you control the banking systems, can't you also set up economic collapse? They did it in 1907 by the panic, and all it was rumors. And what have we already had in the state of Ohio now? 71, is it, savings and loan companies that went under, and millions and billions of dollars in savings gone? Well, I happen to know that there's over 700 banks in the United States, according to Senator Ron Paul, not senator, but House of Representative member, that are now in danger of collapse, and yet the government won't breathe a word, because if they breathed which companies or which banks they were, you and I would go have a run on them and ensure their collapse, because you and I don't want to lose our money. And yet there is only enough insurance right now on all savings in America to cover 0.7% of all money in banks. So that means 0.7% is going to get their money if all the banks in this country fail. That means 99.3% of all other dollars in banks are going to be lost. Would you think this would create an atmosphere of hysteria that would literally bring about either international socialism imposed upon this country or an outright attack because we would be in such a weakened condition? I think it could. Now, in addition, I want to go through just a few more facts which are very difficult to come upon, so that you can be armed with the truth and you can prepare yourself, and I can prepare myself for the coming times that are ahead. Now, here's some cold hard facts that General Keegan gave. Number one, the cost per barrel of oil was soaring from 1973 through 1979 at unprecedented rates. That's when we had the highest inflation in the history of the United States. The prices of homes tripled. A luxury home of $30,000 now costs you $112,000. And then when you figure the interest on that, you're paying nearly $500,000 for a 30-year loan. This is just one example, you see. And so all it does is cut your buying power. Inflation means things cost more, but what it does is cut your buying power of your dollar. Since there's no gold or silver backing, inflation just keeps getting higher and higher, and it costs you more and more money just to survive. And that's the whole goal. They've got to shrink everybody's income down to a compatible lifestyle with the Soviet Union, preparing the day when we'll merge as a one-world government. Now, the OPEC countries are hiking the price of oil because the dollar is dying. It has no gold or silver backing. It's dying on foreign exchanges, and you can watch the what they're trading for, dollars, the yen, and so on, French francs and German marks, and you can see how sometimes the dollar is very weak, and then all of a sudden they'll do something to try to strengthen the dollar. Well, part of the reason why oil has escalated in price from 1973 to 79 was because of the weak dollar. Now, the dollar is dying for a specific reason, because the Federal Reserve System in the United States is controlled by 8 international banking companies, and they are the ones who supply all money to the federal government of the United States, and they're in it for profit for themselves. They couldn't care less how you and I live, because they're in it for profit for themselves. And even though the gross national product of the United States has begun to go down, they still flood us with paper currency, which is becoming less and less valuable. Therefore, prices go up because it takes more of these less valuable dollars to capture the same dress, the same pair of shoes, the same automobile. 4 years ago, I could buy a van, brand new, loaded for $7,800. Now they're $16,000. So you see, this is what's happening when they inflate the dollar. It takes away from you and my living standard. Inflation of the dollar means less buying power, so that the Arabs in the Middle East are getting exactly the same amount of money that they did in 1973 for a barrel of oil, even though it's inflated greatly. And then in 1975 and 1985, they're getting the same value for a barrel of oil because the money is worth less. So the average American home uses 1,806 gallons or 43 barrels of oil per year. This is according to Phillips Petroleum, one of the 8 largest or 11 largest in the United States. About 45% of this is used to produce electricity, 35% for space heating, 12% for cooling, and 8% for heating water. Now, in 1979, the United States alone, just in purchasing fuel and petroleum from the Arab countries, were spending nearly $55 billion. Now, in 1978, that figure was only $42 billion. So you figured a $13 billion a year increase, and if that were to continue, how much longer would it be until we literally reach the $100 and even $200 billion a year just to buy enough fuel to keep this country going? So what does that mean? It means certain economic collapse for this country. There is no way around it. It's got to collapse because Germany, after World War II, collapsed because they had no backing for their money. And so they just had to keep running the printing press to keep giving people money so they could go buy a loaf of bread. That's exactly what's going to happen in the United States, all because of that little siege around Jerusalem and Judah. And the United States of America is a staunch ally, and we will not give up that ally, the last chance against Soviet takeover of all the Middle East. We'll not give them up no matter what they do. So that means little tiny Israel is going to hang on to their territory, and they're going to create or cause, because of the Arabs, a nuclear holocaust. And it's going to drag the rest of the world into it, just like Albert Pike and Giuseppe Mazzini said in August 15, 1871. They said, we'll create 3 world wars. The third one will start in the Middle East. And that's why they said they would have to have, out of the ashes of the Second World War, establish Israel, a homeland for the Jews in the middle of the Arabs, and their natural hostilities would provoke the final cataclysm that would bring world government. And it's exactly what's happening. Now, think since 1973, when the oil embargo happened and there was oil shortages, well, salaries have been going up at an escalating rate. Unemployment has gone up, and it's really depression when you don't have a job, isn't it? It's depression, not just recession. Many layoffs, cutbacks in industry. The American public cannot afford to pay such outrageous amounts for the energy that they're now going to have to pay for. So what George Keegan concluded was, the age of wealth and affluence in America is over. Because of the wealth that people have, it's being drained from their savings account through inflation. And all this is planned. It's all planned. And an 8th thing that he mentioned was that skyrocketing food prices reflects directly on the inflationary policies of the Federal Reserve System, which gives the money at interest-bearing rates to the federal government of the United States. So now do you see why they continue to have a bigger bureaucracy? They won't have cutbacks in any way because those who control the Federal Reserve want inflation over and over again so they can destroy the economy of the United States at the right moment so that they can create their final world government. Now also, skyrocketing real estate prices are directly as a result of the Federal Reserve's policy of printing too much money. So you see everything, food, real estate, all the basic principles, the vital of every nation. Those key elements that people have to have, places to live, food to eat, clothes to buy, those are the very things that are going up in price faster and faster. And do you realize, as of 1980, every American works from January nearly till June 10th just to pay your taxes, not just federal, but you have to include state and local and your sales tax. That's nearly half a year just to pay taxes in this country now. So you wonder why our standard of living is going down, down, and down? And then you have to understand that there are two cartels, and I'm going to name them in the United States now. OPEC is one, but the other is called the Seven Sisters. They are Exxon, Mobil, Standard Oil of Indiana, Standard Oil of California, Shell, Texaco, and Arco. Those seven have interlocking directorates, and they control all oil and energy in the United States practically. And they also, their directors are on the board of directors of the 8 largest banks in the United States. So they control the United States economically. And they're the ones, the very same international banks who supplied the money to keep international communism going in the 1920s and 30s when it would have fallen and collapsed. Now, with all this in mind, I want to go through just a few other things to lay the groundwork for today. Now, the OPEC cartel controls all of the oil that comes out of the ground in the Middle East. And then they deliver it to those nations which are buying it. But the internal United States cartel of oil is the one who does all the refining of the gas, the heating oil. They have complete control of all the operation of oil and all the products, some 600 byproducts of oil in the United States of America. And the original possession of the reserves of oil in this country by their importing and producing it domestically. They produce crude oil, and this, no matter what nation, these are the 7 that controls up to nearly 85 to 90% of all oil that comes into this country. They refine the crude oil into gasoline, oil, fertilizers, and there's some 300 to 600 other byproducts that you and I think is a necessity today. They control them all. So you can see just from this, there are tremendous amounts of profits in the hands of 7 companies, which also control 8 banks. Tremendous profits. And as go these companies, there goes the entire lifestyle of every individual in the United States. The final sales of all these products goes through the dealership of those 7 or 8 oil companies and those 7 or 8 banks. And these 7 sisters are interlocked with the 8 largest banks in the United States, and I've mentioned several of them before, the Chase Manhattan, the Chemical Bank, and JP Morgan Bank, and others, which I'll get into at another time. Now, why is this so important that we understand this background? Well, it's important because Russia is running out of available oil supplies. And you have to understand this. This is why Russia is so interested in 2 areas of the world. The Middle East, where Israel is, and all the Arab countries, and the Western Hemisphere, mainly Alaska, the United States, and Mexico, because that's where the rest of the oil reserves of the world are. And in order for the Soviet Union to keep her military apparatus intact and the strongest in the world, they have to have oil. And it's got to come from the Middle East or the United States. Did you know that right now our own government is now dealing with the Soviet Union and going to give them at no charge whatsoever islands in the Bering Strait which are loaded with oil just to keep the Soviet Union going? Oh yes, it's true. Going to give it to them. And yet we can't even pump our own oil from Gull Island in Alaska. Well, the PLO, if they can't get Israel to give in to their demands, such as returning Jerusalem, returning the West Bank, and returning all of Lebanon, then they're going to come in and create this war that I talked about to start with. And they're going to be backed by the Soviet Union, because this is going to be a Muslim holy war against the state of Israel. And it will literally be, though, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, an oil war. Because without oil, the Soviet Union is going to be shut down. What happened in World War II? Why did Japan even come into the war? Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the complete shutdown of any shipments of oil to Japan. Japan imports 98% of her oil. And therefore they, as a military apparatus and a nation, industrialized nation, were going to be completely shut down and their people would starve because they're overpopulated. They had 90-day oil supply. They either had to go to war to get oil or they would starve, and the Prime Minister or whoever's in charge, Hirohito, he said war rather than let his people die of starvation. All over oil. You see, an industrialized country must have oil or they shrink and they're no longer a threat to the rest of the world. And if the United States were to shrivel up and go away, there would be no one to stop the Soviet Union from their world takeover. However, the book of Ezekiel says there is going to be a confrontation. Now, there's gold and silver. We have to understand this too. They are rising in prices because of our currency. We no longer have a dollar that's backed by gold or silver. So due to inflation, we no longer have gold at a $35 an ounce fixed, so our economy is stable. So now, when did we see back in the 70s, early 80s, that gold had reached over $800 an ounce? And people began to flood into the market to buy gold because they knew the economy was going to collapse. And then all of a sudden, the Federal Reserve loosened up on a little money and the economy straightened out, so the price of gold came back down. All these things are working. But you see, NATO also in Europe has to use fuel. And where does Europe get most of their oil? From the Middle East. They import very little from the United States. Mainly it's from the Arab conglomerates in the Middle East. So you see, now we have a world set up. All the Soviet Union, all the countries which are now in their satellites, Ethiopia, Somalia, Angola, all in Africa, all of the Arab countries which are either dictatorships like Gaddafi, or else they have Soviet-leaning, pro-Marxist leaders like Khomeini in Iran. Every one of them are now set up against Israel, little tiny Israel. But who else do you have that is called Israel in the world today? Didn't we have 10 northern tribes of Israel that went into national captivity way back before Judah ever went into captivity? Well, if this is the case, then where are the other 10 nations? And can we prove that Zechariah here, he talked about Israel and then narrowed it down specifically to little tiny Judah? Can we prove that there are other nations who are going to become involved in this war also? Oil has been termed in newspapers as black gold. Now, it has produced the real wealth by all the sheiks in the Middle East. It's produced all the real wealth in Africa, those few who have oil, in Indonesia. And the most valuable thing other than oil on the face of the earth today is water. Now, without water, 5,000 years of history, you could just eradicate it. I mean, there's been maritime history, trafficking various goods and services that's been an incredible amount of money making as a direct result of this maritime or water shipping. And yet now oil has replaced water as the most valuable thing on the face of the earth. It's changed the entire business community. It's changed the whole complexion of civilization for those who use oil. Transportation is needed. Energy must get to the vital countries, the United States. So they use the ships, and this is where Japan has come in. They've got the greatest super tankers in the history of the world. And for the first time this century, there was a ship built that was larger than Noah's Ark. For the first time in history, when the Japanese super tankers started producing are transporting oil to the United States, to their own country, and they took over the commerce of oil in the world. But since the very earliest time when a man from Turkey and Australia discovered oil in the Middle East, this is when the world has begun to change. It's been a very dramatic thing because, you see, oil controls transportation industry, all transportation, heating of the home, aerospace industry. You would have no aerospace industry without oil. Food production. Do you realize that? A lot of chemical fertilizers come directly from oil. And refinement of food and the storing of food. It even, you have secondary industries that comes directly from oil, such as electricity. That's not your main product, but it does come as a secondary byproduct, electricity. And then you cannot turn electro-combines without it, which produces air conditioning in our homes, lighting, heating, manufacturing. Oil affects every phase of our life. Every phase. There is nothing. You can't drive your automobile. You can't have heat in it. You can't even have an engine that turns without oil that lubricates the motor. And yet you look at nations where there is no oil in use, such as India, most of Africa, and the Far East, such as in China and so on. You have people who are backward. They're still using a wheel and an ox cart and animals that pull their transportation. You have people who are starving because they don't have combines to go out and plant massive crops, and then the combines to come along and harvest those crops. You have poor nutrition. All of these occur in what we call the third and fourth world countries, all because they don't have oil. So you see, oil is the number one commodity on the face of the earth today. And if there is no oil, you and I would not be living in the luxury we have. Now do you begin to see why the Soviet Union is going to come up against Israel? Because they would be plummeted back into the Dark Ages. Their military apparatus would sit there in rust. They couldn't launch their nuclear weapons without oil. And they couldn't field their military hardware anywhere, whether it's in the Middle East or against the United States. So oil is going to be the very thing that catapults the entire world into oblivion unless Jesus Christ stops it. Now, just over 50 years ago, the United States became involved in the Middle East. Exxon, Mobil, Gulf, and I think Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of Ohio, which is the Rockefeller Foundation, they all began to drill for oil in the Middle East. They're the ones who created the oil conglomerates in the Middle East. And yet they nationalized their oil and then sold it. The Arabs nationalized it and then continued to sell it under contract to these 7 companies here in the United States. And oil, I cannot say enough about oil because literally it has everything to do with everything we have. Even a comb that you have in your pocket that's made of plastic. If it wasn't for oil, you wouldn't have that plastic comb. That's how it is. Even baby bottles that are made of plastic. The nipples on those bottles that are made of plastic and so on, or some of them have plastic coatings. All of these things come from oil, and without oil, you and I would literally have a log cabin. We would have a wood-burning stove. We would heat our home with that. We wouldn't have central air. We wouldn't have central heating. We wouldn't have any of the things. We would be going back to 100 years ago, and we would literally be using a wheel, just a wheel and a wagon to get around. And you realize that none of us would probably ever see each other because we have to come so far, and we would be limited within maybe a 5-mile radius, and that's our total existence for our entire life. This is the importance of oil in the world today. Now, we have a problem, though, and that problem is that there is too much consumption in the world by consumers, and there's not enough production by those 7 companies in the United States. So this is creating a problem for the American standard of living. Now, Mexico is beginning to drill for oil, and they've discovered enough oil in Mexico that it's larger than all the reserves in Saudi Arabia. However, there's a problem with that. Now, that is that there is now a Marxist ruler of Mexico. It's not a totally socialist communist state yet, but it is a Marxist leader. So what happens when Nicaragua is so solidified as a communist country and they start spreading out their tentacles all over Central America and right up into Mexico, and they give them the military apparatus and hardware to make it a communist country? there goes all the Mexican oil reserves that the United States could be using. So once again, weakening the position of the United States of America. Now, there is another problem with the oil in Mexico. That is that we have a rift right now with the Mexican government because there are millions of illegal aliens flooding across the border due to the war in Nicaragua, El Salvador, the push for the communists coming up into Mexico, and they want to be at the border of the United States. They wanted to be by December of 1984, but they didn't make it. So with all these illegal aliens coming into the United States, we're having diplomatic problems with Mexico, trying to keep them out and taking them back into their country. So you see, they're not very eager to give us their oil, even though it's available. And the minute we hesitate, the Europeans are going to come over and make negotiations to buy up all their oil because they're not getting it from the Middle East either, like we are. Now, there are some problems. Iran, with her revolutionary and religious unrest since Ayatollah Khomeini, they've cut all production of oil off practically. They've cut all the supply to the United States. We get no oil from them. We used to get 10% from them. None anymore. Saudi Arabia, which was the greatest supplier of oil to the United States, is now cutting back because they're upset with the United States and their Israeli-Egypt peace talks, which we negotiated and helped negotiate with. Plus, the old friend of the United States, the sheik over there, has died, and now his son has succeeded him. And he is pro-Marxist. So there goes another supplier. Remember, we get about 45% of all of our oil from the Arabs. And you've already lost 10% from Iran, and now the Shah, or not the Shah, but the leader of Saudi Arabia has died, and his son, who is pro-Marxist, has now taken over, and they've actually cut back production of oil, much less just sending it to us. Now, under Iran's new revolutionary government, Khomeini, who is a Muslim, he's an avowed Muslim, he also was trained by Marxists in Paris, France. They've cut all oil to the United States off. They are now at war with Iraq, who is another supplier of oil in the Middle East. And since Iraq has been under the gun and their oil fields have been shut down from production. So what do we have? Increased prices since 1979, and where we're up to $1.29, $1.30 a gallon. Unless you're in a big city right where the refineries are, then you can get it at a less cost. Now, I want to skip over just some of this information because I want to get down to the very nitty-gritty today to set the stage for the next sermon I'm going to give in this series. The problem that we're going to have today is the Arabs are going to come right out, I believe, in the future at some time because of Soviet agitation. And the Soviet Union are going to supply them weapons, or else they will blackmail the Arabs into saying, if you want our weapons, then you're going to tell the United States to force Israel to give up the West Bank, tell them to give up all of Jerusalem, or at least part of Jerusalem. And since the Arabs or the Israelis will not do it, we're going to run into a tremendous problem because they're not going to give up any more territory in the Middle East. They've already said that. The current Prime Minister, who replaced Menachem Begin, said that they are tired of giving up and retreating territory. And they're not giving up any more territory once they've completed, they say, their pullout of Lebanon. I don't know if they will or not. We'll have to wait and see. But I believe that there is going to come a war in the Middle East all over oil, and it could set the stage for the final conflict that can pull in not only the Middle East, one tribe, Judah, but also, what about Ezekiel 38 and 39? And I want to go into it next time. But just a couple of scriptures as we close the sermon for today. Amos chapter 3. Amos is a little book, but he's dynamite. He's got a lot of information stuffed away in his pages. In chapter 3, verse 7, it says, surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he reveals his secret unto his servants the prophets. And it seems like in the last 5 and 6 years there's been a lot of information coming up that if when you put it all together, you can see the puzzle pieces fitting. How you can draw all 12 tribes of Israel, the 10 lost tribes, with little tiny Judah in the Middle East, and Europe, which is a large part of it is lost Israel also, with the United States and Canada, all of these, the rest of the free world, into that all-out final conflict which will produce the return of Jesus Christ to save Israel. Now, let's go back to Zechariah chapter 12. I just want to review this right before we go into a couple of New Testament or a couple other scriptures. In Zechariah 12 again, and I want to start in verse 2. Behold, I'll make Jerusalem a cup of trembling under all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem. They are in a siege now. They have been since 1948. There's been 6 wars, 4 of them major wars, and now they're preparing, and they say themselves that the next war will be the final war. They say it. They know it. They know it'll be nuclear. To be exact, the last time Menachem Begin was ready to mash the button which would have unleashed 13 nuclear weapons against the Arabs if they hadn't have won. They were ready to fight to the finish. Verse 3, and in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. Isn't that exactly what's happening? When you have all the Soviet bloc that's going to come in and invade, and the United States, which is an ally of Israel, and the only ally left. The European nations won't have anything to do with Israel because of the very problem about oil. They know that the Arabs will cut off their oil too. And that's where 90% of their oil comes from, the Middle East. So you see, we've got a whole world set up all because of oil and because a little tiny state of Israel in the Middle East. All that burden themselves with it, that's Judah in the Middle East, shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. Now, let's go back to Luke 21. Review that for a second. Luke 21, scripture started with, verse 20 to 24. With all I've said about the oil now, and the Arabs in the Middle East, and they are only one of the conglomerates. There's 2 of them in the world, oil cartels. When you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, and we see the Arab armies, and even now the Soviet armies are down on the border of Iraq and Iran, and there's over 9,000 military advisors in Syria right now, teaching them to use their equipment, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. I'll skip verse 21. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. And then the middle of verse 23. For there shall be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. So it's definitely going to be wrath upon the Judean people, or the tribe of Judah that lives in the Middle East. And they shall fall to the edge of the sword, shall be led captive into all nations. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, 2 more scriptures, or actually 3. But remember we talked about when we opened up the sermon in Zechariah 12, it said Israel, and then immediately it went from Israel down to Judah. Well, what about the other tribes? There is coming the same Holocaust, you might call it, upon the rest of the nations of Israel. It says so. Jeremiah 30. Jeremiah 30, verse 7. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. This is described, and we're going to see it in Matthew. It is even the time of Jacob, or Israel's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. And immediately the salvation of Israel, not just tiny Judah, which is one of the 12 tribes, but all of Israel, the United States, Canada, and even the Western democracies of Europe. All of them. It's going to be a time for their trouble. So the world is set up now so that you've got all the communist world against the Western free world. And who makes up the Western free world? The 10 lost tribes of Israel, Canada, the United States, Great Britain, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, a part of France, part of Germany, the Netherlands, the lowlands, Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark. Those are the free countries of the world left. And little tiny Israel in the Middle East. And who is it that the Soviet Union and all of communism is aimed at today? Jacob. Not just Judah, which we've been talking about mainly today, but all 12 tribes of Israel. Now look at Matthew 24. This parallels with what we've been talking about in Luke 21. But Matthew 24 expands this final nuclear conflagration. It says in verse 21 and 22, For then shall be great tribulation, and we know it's going to start in the Middle East because it's already said in Luke 21 that it's going to happen in Judah. And it's going to be great distress upon that land and that people. And then in Jeremiah 37, it expands it to Jacob's, all Israel's trouble. And now, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. There can only be one greatest happening in the world that would never be like it before nor after it again. And that could only be the nuclear conflagration that is going to take place in the Middle East and the Western Hemisphere when Russia finally attacks. And except those days, verse 22, should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect, that's you, see? For the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Now, my last scripture for today is Ezekiel chapter 3. Because I think this is so important, we need to tell the people of this land, if they'll just listen. And that's the hard problem, getting people to listen. They don't want to hear anything bad. And you know, it gets kind of tiresome talking about things that are bad, but when you know there's a burden and you have to tell people, that's the way it is, and you have to do it. Now, Ezekiel chapter 33. I'm going to start in verse 1 through 4. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, eat that you find, eat this roll, and go speak unto the house of Israel. So here's the 10 tribes that are lost. This book was written 130 years after Israel, the northern 10 tribes, went into national captivity. Judah had never gone into the Babylonian captivity as yet. And so he couldn't be talking to Judah, who was sitting there. He's talking to the house of Israel. And we have 4 whole books of the Bible giving the national lineage of the house of Israel and their separate kings, house of Judah. So when he's talking to the house of Israel, he's talking to the 10 tribes. When he talked to Judah, which we saw in Zechariah, he's talking to little tiny Israel now in the Middle East. So here's a whole book, which I've proven before in another sermon, over 70 scriptures in the first 36 chapters talking specifically to the house of Israel, the 10 lost tribes. He said, so I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that roll. And he said unto me, Son of man, cause your belly to eat, and fill your bowels with this roll that I give you. Then did I eat it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. It was good to know, and yet it was going to be a terrible thing that's coming. But it's good that you know about it in advance. And he said unto me, Son of man, go, get you unto the house of Israel. Remember, they'd already been removed 130 years out of sight. They'd lost the Sabbath day and the holy days as an identifying sign. They had lost all identity. They thought they were just a part of the nations of the earth. They didn't know they were a part of Israel. And speak my words unto them. So here he is, verse 5. For you are not sent to a people of a strange speech and of hard language, but to the house of Israel. So, and who was it that Jesus said, I'm not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel? So the people of Israel should hear this book. They should, when it's spoken to them, because he said it, I'm not sending you to somebody of strange speech, but you should be able to understand this book. It's written to a lost group of people, and it's not written to anyone else. Now, verse 6. Not to many people of a strange speech and a hard language, whose words you cannot understand. Surely had I sent you to them, they would have listened unto you. But what did Jesus say? He said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own house and his own country. And so here, the book of Ezekiel was written to the house of Israel, the 10 lost tribes, and yet they're the very ones that say, oh no, that was fulfilled years and years ago. It's not for us. So Jesus didn't listen to in his own house. But the house of Israel will not listen unto you, for they will not listen unto me. For all the house of Israel, well, they're hard-hearted, stiff-necked, as we've seen in many scriptures. Behold, I've made your face strong against their faces, and your forehead strong against their foreheads. As an adamant harder than flint have I made your forehead. So whoever this watchman is going to be, group of people, or who's going to shout the warning message to this country, God says, look, I'm going to set your head against theirs, and no matter what, don't you flinch, you say it, no matter whether they'll listen or not. Fear them not, neither be dismayed at their looks, for though they are a rebellious house. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, all my words that I shall speak unto you receive in your heart, and hear with your ears, and that's what we as a group that are going to witness to the rest of the United States must do. Listen to it, absorb it, and when we have opportunity, tell it to somebody else. Don't force it upon them, but at least tell it. Verse 11, and go get you to them of the captivity. See, 130 years before Judah went into captivity, these people went into captivity. Unto the children of your people, and speak unto them, and tell them, thus says the Lord God, whether they'll hear or whether they'll forbear. And of course we know they won't listen. Final verse today, verse 17. Son of man, I've made you a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word at my mouth, and give them warning from me. Brethren, I want this to go out on radio so that people will know. Friday afternoon, the 14th of June, 1985, we had a radio program that was on KXEN in St. Louis. We picked it up coming across the Kentucky-Illinois border. And I mean, it was so powerful that if anybody was listening, I don't see how they could resist at least wanting information about it. Telling about what's going on in this country, and it thrilled me. I mean, I was the one that gave it, but it still thrilled me to know that, hey, it's at least going out and somebody's going to have an opportunity to hear it. And it was kind of exciting to know that somebody at least could hear. Well, we'll continue next time, part 2.